Chapter 1. Slade Henderson smiled at the woman in front of him. He'd taken to using a computer dating service, which made him feel like a loser, so he could find a woman who wouldn't be scared off by his profession. It was ridiculous just how many women wrinkled their nose and wanted nothing to do with an OBGYN. He was sure there were other professions where the reaction was the same, but for women to feel that way about him was ridiculous. Having his own medical practice should have been a mark in his favor, not something against him. This was his first date with her, and he really wished he could remember her name, but he had no clue who she was. She was a teacher, and that's about all he remembered from her profile. He'd had too many long nights and been on too many first dates lately for him to remember anything else. "So what grade do you teach?" he asked. "I teach 7th grade math. I always thought I'd hate junior high, but I find I love it." He took a sip of his iced tea. "Why did you think you'd hate it?" "Because you've got the bounciness and overexcitability of the elementary kids, plus the raging hormones of the high schoolers all in one group. It does make things more interesting, but I've found this is the age when the kids learn whether or not they really like math. I love to watch their love for it bloom." "And their hatred?" he asked with a grin. "Well, not that part as much." He noticed she had a K on a chain around her neck. "So her name started with a K." He thought for a moment and finally came up with it. "Karen." Her name was Karen. "Do you find most kids hate math or love it?" "Oh, most are definitely in the hate column. I'll have 5 or so out of a class of 25 who absolutely adore it, though, and that keeps me going from year to year." "How long have you been teaching?" Slade asked as their steaks were slipped in front of them. 5 years. "I'm 27. How long have you been a doctor?" Karen asked, cutting into her steak to make sure it was cooked correctly. "I've had my own practice for 2 years. I'm 35. "You're a PCP, right?" she asked, taking a bite of her baked potato. He shook his head. "No, I'm an OBGYN." She immediately began choking on her potato, and quickly grabbed her water to try to wash it down. "Really? So you look at women's," she trailed off, unable to finish her question. "I deliver babies, and I deal with women's health issues, yes." He watched her closely, knowing almost immediately that she wasn't going to go out with him again. He wondered if female urologists dealt with these same issues. Maybe he should try to date a urologist. "Have you ever, dated a patient?" He shook his head. "No, I haven't. I don't think that would be a comfortable position for either of us to be in." She took a bite of her steak, chewing it slowly as she studied him, her mind obviously racing with the new information about his occupation. "Do you get turned on when you're examining someone?" He mentally sighed, realizing the night was going to go downhill from there. When his phone rang, and he saw it was the hospital, he was relieved. "Hello?" The voice of one of the nurses from labor and delivery at the hospital in North Fort Worth, where he practiced, came on the line. "Dr. Henderson, Abigail Daly is in labor. Contractions are 4 minutes apart. I'm on my way." This was Mrs. Daly's 4th child, and she had a tendency to deliver before he could make it to the hospital. He hung up on the nurse and looked at his date. "I'm sorry. I've got a delivery." He pulled out his wallet and dropped some cash on the table. "It was lovely meeting you." She looked up at him with a startled expression. "You're leaving in the middle of dinner?" He nodded, getting to his feet. "I don't really have a choice. Babies don't wait for me to finish my steak." He strode toward the front of the restaurant, glad he'd insisted they bring separate cars. He'd had too many disastrous first dates to be willing to do anything else. Asterisk. Slade checked in with his twin brother, Seth, on his way to work the following morning. Seth had just married, and Slade worried about him. He didn't know enough about his brother's new wife. "Hey, you. Seth's voice sounded sleepy. Hi. What's happening? On my way to the office. You sound tired. Yeah, we're in Boston for a bit. I had some work I needed to do for Daniel. Slade knew that Daniel had been Seth's best friend since college. How's he doing? Great. His wife is having a baby. Oh, that's great. Daniel was a good guy. I'd say tell him you know a good OB, but I doubt if his wife wants to fly to Texas for her appointments. I don't see Brenda doing that, actually. How's married life treating you? Slade asked, getting to the topic he really wanted to discuss. It's good. Really good. Mom and Michelle met for the first time yesterday, and they got along great. Slade smiled. I need to see Mom soon. How's she doing? Fine. She misses her boys, and it's time for us both to start giving her some grandchildren. Slade grinned at that. I knew she'd go there as soon as you got married. What were you thinking? Their mother always had something she nagged them about, and it had been about them finding a wife for years. Now she'd moved on, and he wasn't ready to hear it was time for babies. Seth laughed. I was thinking I envied what Daniel had, and I needed a woman of my own. Tell me about her. How'd you meet? Oh, I never told you, did I? I hired a matchmaker. She introduced us at the altar. Daniel did the same thing. Slade laughed, sure his brother was joking. You've got to be kidding me. I'm dead serious. Best thing I ever did. Let me know if you want her phone number. Slade made a face. Despite a series of awful first dates, I'm not quite that desperate yet. Seth laughed at that. If you saw my wife, you'd know how funny that really is. Text me if you want her number. Seriously. Dr. Lachelle could find you the woman who is exactly right for you, and save you all the dating and getting to know you time. Trust me. She's worth every penny. Don't hold your breath. I won't. Asterisk. When Slade made the phone call to Dr. Lachelle Simpson at Matrimony a month later, he was uncertain what to expect. This is Dr. Lachelle. Hi, my name is Slade Henderson. You matched my brother to his bride. Oh, of course, Mr. Henderson. Are you interested in finding a wife? Asked the soft voice that sounded like a little girl's. She had to be older than she sounded. Yes, I am. He didn't correct her about his title. Why bother? Are you in the Boston area as well? She asked. No, I live in North Texas. I went to medical school here and just never left. I'm told it's a fine state. She was silent for a moment. I can come, not this weekend, but the next for your interview. Does that work? Interview? How long will that take? An entire day. He looked at the weekend in question on his calendar. He had no plans, but he never knew when a baby would decide to come. I can probably do that. Unless I'm called in to deliver a baby. Well, I'll come on Friday night, and we'll start. If you have to deliver a baby, I'll just amuse myself, and we'll keep trying. I'll plan to be there both Saturday and Sunday just in case. Will it matter if we have to do half one day and half the other? He asked. No, not at all. Just so I get all my questions asked and answered. I can't find you the perfect bride otherwise. If the perfect bride existed, he'd be shocked. He'd try this though. He wanted children, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life alone. Sounds good. I'll call you when I get there, and we'll make plans. The line went dead. He stared at his phone for a moment, trying to figure out what had just happened. She hadn't really hung up on him, had she? Asterisk. Heidi Hart rubbed the back of her neck as she headed back to her office. She'd been working for 10 hours straight, and she needed to go home. They were short-staffed again, and it was her turn to cover for the sick nurse. Her boss, Vicky Hamilek, had done it last time. She hoped the stomach flu had run its course. It seemed like everyone had been out with it for at least 24 hours. Heidi. Heidi turned, looking at the young CNA who was calling her. What's wrong, Ashley? It's Mr. Jacobs. I think he finally died. Heidi looked at Ashley. Finally? It's a good thing we're alone. She didn't have to scold the girl, because she knew she would get her meaning. Ashley sighed. You know what I mean. He's been acting like he was going to die for 3 weeks. Besides, he's 102. Let me go check. Mr. Jacobs' daughter had signed a do not resuscitate order, so no one needed to stay with him and try to revive him. Dealing with death was Heidi's least favorite part of the job, but working in a nursing home, she was used to it, whether she wanted to be or not. Walking into the patient's private room, she approached the bed cautiously. The first time she'd checked on a patient someone had told her was dead, he'd started talking to her, and she'd almost had a heart attack herself. She wasn't going through that again. She carefully reached out a hand to touch him, and he didn't move. Picking up his hand, she put her fingers on his wrist. No pulse. She sighed sadly, slowly shutting off all the machines in his room and removing his phone. She picked up the phone and called his family, before she began the painstaking process of bathing him and preparing him so his family could see him one last time before they sent him to the funeral home. Now, Mr. Jacobs, you know you've been one of my favorite patients for a long time. I'm happy to get you ready to go, but we need to make a deal here. As long as I'm touching you and in the room with you, you have to promise not to move. It always makes me uncomfortable when dead people move. I'm not sure why, but it does, so you have to not do it. Okay, Mr. Jacobs? She heard the door open behind her. You're losing your mind, Heidi. Heidi jumped, spinning around to see her superior, Vicky, standing behind her. I know I am. I just hate getting them ready to leave here. Vicky nodded. It's not my favorite thing either, but I don't usually have long conversations with them about how they need to not move. We each do our job our own way, Heidi said with a shrug, finishing up. I'm glad his daughter finally signed the DNR. I was sure she was going to keep dragging her feet, and one of us was going to be stuck here doing artificial respiration until an ambulance arrived. Vicky shrugged. I had a talk with her about it, and she finally agreed. I'm not even going to ask what you said, because I probably don't want to know. No, I don't think you do. Vicky said with a laugh. I'm heading out. Are you sure you can handle another late shift? You look dead on your feet. You were here until midnight and came back at 8 this morning. It's my turn. Besides, I have tomorrow off, and I'm going to sleep in. All right. I'll be glad when everyone is over this stomach bug, and we're fully staffed on a regular basis again. Heidi sighed. Me too. The worst part about having to have a certain number of nurses working at all times was that the workload was heavy for those in charge. They had an on-call list like every other facility, but the people who were on call didn't always choose to take the shift. All right. I'll see you Monday morning. You sleep this weekend. I can't afford to have you getting sick too, because then I'll be taking all these extra shifts myself. Vicky was old enough to be Heidi's mother. You don't need the extra hours any more than I do. Asterisk. When Heidi got home that night, she sank into her favorite chair with her iPad for a few minutes before she got ready for bed. Her life had become an endless cycle of work and sleep. They needed to hire a few more nurses for the on-call list, so she and Vicky could both take more time off. Soon. She tapped on her email and pulled it up, smiling when she saw there was a message from her cousin, Sissy, in Wisconsin. I'm ready for this baby to get here already. Thought you might like a few pictures of how huge I am. Bob says I'm still as beautiful as ever, But we all know Deputy Bob has a blind spot where I'm concerned. Thank God. I don't know that he'd put up with me otherwise. There was a picture beneath of her cousin, who looked like she was 10 months pregnant with triplets. Heidi made a face. That had to hurt. Heidi knew Sissy had used some kind of matchmaker to set her up with her husband, and she'd been thrilled with the man the matchmaker found for her. Heidi had cringed when she'd first heard about it, because one of the stipulations had been they would meet for the first time at the altar. The more she thought about it, the more she liked the idea. She had no time to date, and when she tried, the men ended up being freaks. Maybe it was time she talked to Sissy's matchmaker friend and found a man of her own. She didn't want to be too old when she married, and she was already 29. Not that 29 was old, but she wanted kids. She quickly tapped out a response before she lost her nerve. You look great in a "I'm worried you're about to explode into a million tiny pieces" way. I hope you don't feel as miserable as you look in that picture. I've got a question for you. What's the name of the matchmaker you used? I think I'm ready to take the plunge. The dating scene is as sucky as ever, and you know the hours I work. There's no time to date anyway. Heidi was startled when she had a response 10 minutes later. Sissy was an early person, not a night owl like she was. Dr. Lachelle Simpson. Name of the company is Matrimony. Tell her you're my cousin. She is an absolute wonder. Baby's sitting on my bladder. Going back to bed now that I'm empty. Sissy had included the matchmaker's phone number at the end of the email. Heidi grabbed her phone off the end table, quickly dialing the number. It was a New York City number judging by the area code, so she knew she'd be getting voicemail, but at least she'd have made the first step. She wouldn't have the courage if she didn't just do it. When a live person actually answered, Heidi almost dropped the phone. It wasn't quite as bad as a dead person moving while she was getting them cleaned up, but it was close. This is Dr. Lachelle. I thought I'd be getting voicemail. Why would you want to talk to voicemail when you could talk to me? Heidi had to chuckle at the question. No reason, I guess. I'm Heidi Hart. I'm Sissy Anderson's cousin. Oh, hey there, Heidi Hart. Are you from Wisconsin too? You sure don't sound like you're from Wisconsin. Well, I was born there, and lived there until I was about 5, but I've lived in Texas since. Texas. I was in Texas just a few weeks ago. What part are you in? I live in Roanoke, but I work in Northlake. Both are just north of Fort Worth. Sounds good. What are you doing this weekend? I went to Babe's when I was there last time, and I need some more of that chicken fried steak. Heidi smiled. We have a Babe's here in Roanoke. And I'm sleeping this weekend. What are you doing? I think I'm flying to Texas to meet you and interview you. How would that be? It's already Friday night. I can't ask you to change your plans at the last minute. Oh, you're not asking me to. That chicken fried steak is. I'll make the plans. I'll probably be there by tomorrow afternoon. We'll have dinner at Babe's tomorrow night, and then I'll interview you on Sunday. Heidi stared at the dead phone in her hand. I guess I'm going to Babe's tomorrow, she mumbled to herself as she hung up the phone. It was a good thing the food there was so good, because she might have had to be grumpy about being told what to do otherwise. Heidi had always been a strong, independent woman, and she didn't need anyone telling her what to do. Asterisk. It was after 11 when Heidi woke the following morning, but she refused to feel guilty. She'd worked over 60 hours that week, and that was enough to exhaust anyone. There hadn't been any calls, which must mean that the weekend shift had all shown up for work. Thank God. Maybe the stomach bug had actually run its course for everyone. Heidi started her laundry and cleaned up the house. There wasn't a lot to do around her apartment, because she lived alone and she wasn't horribly messy. She lived in an older house that had been converted into 2 apartments, and she loved it. She had the upstairs, and a sweet, little old lady lived below her. She tried to look out for her. She got a call shortly after 1, and she swiped her finger across the phone, not recognizing the number. Hello? Hello, Heidi Hart. This is Dr. Lachille. I got an earlier flight than expected. Do you want me to start the interview today and finish tomorrow? Or would you rather do it all tomorrow? Heidi was definitely a woman who preferred to just tear the band-aid off, rather than do it slowly. Get the pain over with. She felt the same about the interview. She wanted it done. Let's do it. I'm staying in Roanoke. Give me your address, and I'll have the GPS get me there. When Heidi first saw Lachille 20 minutes later, she was certain it was the wrong woman. Her hair was streaked with purple, and she had a purple shirt on. Dr. Lachille? Are you expecting another crazy middle-aged woman today? Heidi couldn't help but smile. No, you're the only one. Well, get over here and bump boobies with me then. Any cousin of Sissy's is a cousin of mine. Heidi approached the older woman gingerly, not quite sure what to think of her. This couldn't be the woman Sissy had referred to as a matchmaking genius, could it? Once they were sitting, Dr. Lachille was all business, and the sheer amount of questions she asked let Heidi know she was indeed knowledgeable about her craft. They took a break for dinner and went to Babe's like Dr. Lachille wanted. I can't believe how good the food is here. We can get lots of good food in New York, but we can't get Southern food like this. And I hate Mexican food there. Texas is the place for Mexican for sure. Heidi nodded. It sure is. Have you tried Taco Bueno yet? I promise you, if you want Mexican fast food, that's where you need to go. It's to die for. Dr. Lachille shook her head as she cut off a piece of her chicken fried steak. I'll be sure to try it. I'm always in the mood for some Mexican food. After Dr. Lachille left the following day, Heidi realized she hadn't told Dr. Lachille her #1 requirement in a husband, that he not be a doctor. She hated doctors. They were always full of themselves and impossible to work with. She couldn't imagine actually having to live with one. She'd started out working in hospitals when she'd first gotten her nursing degree, but she'd learned very quickly that a nursing home was better for her. Fewer doctors and more nurses made her life so much better. She thought for a moment about calling Dr. Lachille and telling her that she couldn't, under any circumstances, match her up with a doctor, but really? What chance was there that a doctor would be matched to her? Even if there were a doctor in the area who was ready to marry, why would it be to her? It didn't make sense. No, she'd just let it go. The chances were too slim for her to worry about it. Chapter 2. Heidi's wedding day didn't begin as she'd wanted. What else was new? She had to run some paperwork up to the nursing home first thing in the morning, and when she got home, she couldn't figure out where she'd put her shoes. Her new shoes that were still in the box and she'd planned to wear for her wedding. Those shoes. She tore up her apartment, looking everywhere, and finally found them an hour later, once she decided she'd always wanted to be a barefoot bride. They were tucked under her wedding dress, which was hanging in her closet. It made perfect sense as soon as she found them. She wouldn't lose them there. She sighed, certain she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Yes, she wanted children and she wanted to be married, but what kind of man would put up with a nurse's crazy schedule? Especially one who worked the kind of hours she did. She hurriedly got the rest of her things together before making the 40-minute drive south to the church she'd attended as a child. Her mother was meeting her there, and her father and brother would be joining later. Her parents both thought she was insane for agreeing to marry a stranger, and her brother, well, Mark couldn't seem to stop laughing. The jerk. Who needs a brother anyway? When she got to the church, she saw the parking lot was mostly empty, which was a good thing. She didn't want to accidentally run into her future husband, whoever he may be. Dr. Lachille had told her to be at the church at 10. It was already 1:15. She hated being late. She ran into the church, slamming the door to the bride's room as soon as she reached it. Her mother was waiting there, frowning at her. "It's not too late to back out, Heidi." "I'm not backing out, Mom." As much as she'd been thinking about backing out just 20 minutes earlier, her mother suggesting it made her that much more determined to go through with it. What if he's a homicidal maniac? Dr. Lachille, she's the matchmaker, assured me he's perfectly normal. I've never met a normal man in my life. I have to marry him, just so I can see what this rare beast looks like. Surely you can see that. Heidi kicked off her flip-flops. Is Carol still coming to do my hair? Her mother nodded. Yes. She said she'd be here any minute. Oh, good. I was worried about my hair looking this flat all day. The door slammed open, and Heidi looked up to see her mom's friend, Carol, entering the room. She was carrying half a beauty salon with her and looked like she was prepared for any potential disaster. I'm here. Prepare to be beautiful. Heidi shook her head. She'd never been able to figure out why her quiet mother was so close to the flamboyant hairdresser. I'm prepared mentally, but I don't know if anyone can truly prepare for that physically. While Carol was plugging in her supplies, Heidi's best friend, Jenna, hurried into the room. I'm here. What did I miss? The wedding doesn't start for 2 hours. What could you have missed? I was kind of hoping for chocolate. Jenna patted her burgeoning belly. Baby's hungry for chocolate. Heidi laughed. You're going to lose that excuse in 5 months, and you'll have to go back to admitting to be a chocoholic. I'm allowed a few months out of time. That's what you said with Sophia. I don't think you ever quit patting your belly and saying the baby was hungry for chocolate. Jenna smiled. I didn't. I never totally lost the baby bump, so I fooled strangers forever. Heidi rolled her eyes as Carol motioned for her to sit in a chair. Is that bridesmaid dress going to fit you? She asked. Oh, sure. I tried it on last night. I wore it for Jessica's wedding, when I was 6 months pregnant with Sophia. That's why I was pretty sure it would fit. Oh, that's right. That's why we have matching dresses. Jessica had been one of their crowd in high school. Have you had a chance to see her baby yet? I saw them last night. We shared a babysitter and did the double date thing. It was nice, just wish we could all come up with a topic that didn't involve the kids. Heidi smiled at that. Well, you and Jessica are both stay-at-home moms. I can't imagine there's a ton to talk about other than the kiddos. Heidi had a lot of respect for moms who stayed home with the kiddos, but she knew she could never do it. She was too involved in her career. Jenna pulled up a chair beside Heidi's. Just wait until you're 15 months pregnant, and you've forgotten what your toes look like, let alone remembered your pedicure. You'll understand then. Heidi shook her head at her friend. You do know the gestation period for a human is only 9 months, right? I do. I also know the last month takes 7 months. The 7 longest months of your entire life. Heidi refused to listen. Jenna had been willing to do it again, so it couldn't have been that bad. Help me stop feeling nervous. You're about to take the longest short walk of your life to a total stranger who is probably going to be one of the rejects she refused to date in high school, but a good man deep down. He's probably been dreaming of Heidi Hart, the most beautiful girl in school for the past 12 years, and he bribed the matchmaker to set you two up. He'll have become a billionaire at 25 with some high-tech thing that no one understands but him, and you will spend the rest of your life being wined, dined, and treated like a queen. You'll be whisked off to exotic locations at the drop of a hat, and spend the rest of your life making the rest of us jealous. Jenna popped a piece of emergency chocolate into her mouth. Feel better yet? Heidi shook her head. No, I need a piece of your emergency chocolate. She looked at her mother. Mom, would you have Mark stop on his way here and get me some tacos? Her mother nodded, pulling her phone out of her purse. Bueno? Are there any other fast food tacos in this great state of ours? Heidi was dressed and had her hair done by the time Dr. Lachille arrived. Dr. Lachille was eating tacos out of a bag with Taco Bueno emblazoned on the side. I'm so glad you told me about this place, Heidi. I just wish they had them in Manhattan. Heidi grinned over her shoulder, thrilled to have created another Bueno head. You have to sit still if you don't want to look like a clown. Carol rubbed a smudge of eyeshadow off Heidi's face as she scolded her. Glad you like my favorite tacos, Dr. Lachille. Heidi carefully kept her face pointed in the right direction. Mom, meet Dr. Lachille, the matchmaker. Dr. Lachille, meet my mother. Her mom stood and shook hands with Dr. Lachille. How much research did you really do on this man? She blurted out almost immediately. Dr. Lachille laughed. This is how I always do my matches. It's going to be all right, Mrs. Hart. I promise. Heidi is not the first woman I've matched at the altar, and she won't be the last. I matched the groom's brother back in May. I matched quadruplet sisters to 4 cowboys in Wyoming in April. My business has been going strong for quite some time. She pulled out her phone. Let me show you all the matrimony midgets. What is a matrimony midget? Heidi's mom asked, her voice filled with horror. Heidi covered her mouth, trying not to let peals of laughter erupt through the room. Mom, she matched up Sissy and Bob. You've heard Uncle Andrew talk about how happy Sissy is. Why didn't you tell me she matched Sissy and Bob? Her mother demanded. I didn't think to tell you how I met her until just this second. Now you can calm down, right? I don't think I'll ever calm down. This is a ridiculous situation you put yourself in, Heidi. You remember Sissy's best friend? Cinderella? She was matched by Dr. Lachille as well. So there are 2 people you've met that have been matched by this woman. I'll be perfectly safe. She's got a great track record. Heidi just wished she could believe the words herself. She'd already signed the agreement to stay together for a full year, so she'd better start believing. Lachille finished showing off her munchkins on her phone. I'm going to go check on the groom. Need to make sure he hasn't had a fit of nerves. Can you tell me anything at all about him, Dr. Lachille? Heidi asked, her nerves getting the better of her. Sure. He's a man, and you're going to love him. The snap of the door closing was all anyone heard over Dr. Lachille's laughter. Heidi's mother looked at her. You put your confidence in that woman? Heidi shrugged. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Asterisk. Slade was pacing back and forth in the small room Dr. Lachille had told him to stay in. His twin was sitting in a chair ignoring him while talking softly to his wife. How did you survive this horrible feeling you have to be doing something wrong? Slade asked. Seth laughed, looking away from Michelle for just a moment. I didn't make a mistake at all, and neither are you. Dr. Lachille is a genius at what she does. Trust her. You're not the first couple she matched, right? I mean, you told me she matched Daniel to his wife, but the same way? At the altar? Michelle got to her feet and walked to him. I talked to Brenda, Daniel's wife. I know they're very happy. I also know a school friend of Brenda's was married to a man in Oklahoma, and they're very happy. She does this all the time. She's good at it. You have to let her show you the woman who's perfect for you, and you have to trust that she can do it. She stood on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. You're Seth's brother, and I want you to be happy. Trust us if you can't trust her. Slade looked at Seth. Was her hair purple when you met her? Seth nodded. As far as I can tell, the woman was born with purple hair. That doesn't make her bad at what she does. I guess not. He stopped abruptly when the door opened. You just what? Seth turned to Dr. Lachelle. He's worried about your purple hair and whether or not you can make a good match. Dr. Lachelle sighed. Do I need to show you my matrimony munchkins? I just had to show the bride's mother. Slade shook his head, not in answer to her question, but in confusion. What's a matrimony munchkin? It's a baby that was born to a couple I matched, of course. How is that going to help me believe you know how to match people who will fall in love? I'm a doctor. I do know where babies come from. In fact, I deliver them on a fairly regular basis. Dr. Lachelle laughed. I'm sure you do. Want to see my munchkins anyway? Slade resumed his pacing, wishing the crazy woman would just go away. She wasn't helping at all. Dr. Lachelle sat down next to Seth and showed him the photos on her phone, and Michelle sat down and looked as well. Slade just kept pacing, refusing to believe people were going on with their lives when he was about to do the craziest thing he'd ever done in his entire life. Asterisk. Heidi gripped her father's arm tightly as she waited for her turn to walk up the aisle. She watched as Jenna walked into the sanctuary and the door closed again. Jenna looked so cute in her dress with her baby bump. She tried to cover it with the flowers, but it didn't work. Not that Heidi cared. The music changed, and the coordinator nodded at Heidi and her father. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. Her dad shook his head. This is crazy. You don't have to go through with it. I want to. Heidi wasn't sure if her words were true or not, but she'd come too far to back out now. The doors opened, and her eyes went to the front of the church to the man she'd spend at least the next year with, but hopefully she'd be with him for the rest of her life. She saw him staring back at her at the end of the long aisle, and her eyes met his. His looked dark from where she stood, but it was hard to tell. He seemed so far away. Her knees wanted to buckle and give way, but she wasn't going to let them. It would be just like her to trip at the last minute and fall on him, so she carefully concentrated on every step. When she stood beside the stranger, and her hand was placed in his, she gave an involuntary shiver. It felt so strange to stand next to someone she'd never met, but had already agreed to spend the rest of her life with. Of course, at that moment, she was more worried about spending the night with him. She listened as the pastor gave a quick sermon on the sanctity of marriage and the role of the husband and the wife. Well, she pretended to listen. She was too busy looking at the tall, handsome man beside her. She didn't even know his name. Do you, Slade Henderson, take Heidi Hart to be your lawfully wedded wife? To love, honor, and cherish as long as you both shall live? I do. His voice was deep and solemn as he answered, and it sent a frisson of excitement straight into Heidi's stomach. He was sexy. How had she lived her entire life without this man beside her? And why was he willing to relocate to Fort Worth? His eyes were boring into hers. He finally mouthed, "Say I do." Heidi realized she'd missed her vows entirely. Hopefully the pastor had been smart enough not to order her to obey. I do. She felt like an idiot, but whatever. She was busy staring at the sexy man in front of her, and who could blame her for that? I now pronounce you husband and wife. Slade, you may kiss your bride. Heidi's eyes widened. Why hadn't she considered that her first kiss with her new husband would be in front of a congregation of witnesses? How crazy! Slade leaned down and brushed his lips across hers. He wasn't comfortable with their first kiss being in front of a huge room of people, so he kept it brief. When he lifted his head, he looked down into her beautiful green eyes. Dr. Lachelle said it's normal at one of these weddings for the bride and groom to take a couple of minutes alone in the bride's room. To talk a bit and learn about each other. Heidi nodded. I'm all for that. She hadn't planned a big reception anyway, preferring to spend the time getting to know her new husband. She gulped as she thought the words. Her husband. Oh wow, could she really go through with this? Slade took her hand and walked toward the back of the church and toward the bride's room. Everyone stared at them, and he ignored them all. He had to make sure to introduce her to Seth and Michelle before they left to go back to Louisiana, but more than anything, he wanted to be with her. When they got to the back, he closed and locked the door, sagging against it. That was the single most nerve-wracking experience of my entire life. Heidi laughed. Mine too. I hadn't even considered that we'd be kissing for the first time ever in front of all those people, or I'd have asked the pastor to take that part out of the ceremony. She sank into a chair facing him. I'm glad that part's over. Slade frowned. You're glad our first kiss is over? But we can't ever get it back, and it didn't feel like a first kiss to me. It felt like, I don't know. Like we were rushing to get it over with so we could move on. Heidi frowned. Well, yeah, it did seem rushed, but what were we going to do with everyone and their dog watching us? He sat down beside her, taking her hand in his thumb rubbing over her palm, sending shivers through her. We could call that acting and have a real first kiss. We could? Her eyes met his, and she was thrilled to see how brown they were. He was pretty incredible to look at. He nodded. If you're game, that is. Heidi laughed. I'm definitely game. A first kiss should be memorable and make fireworks go off in my head. You capable? Slade raised a brow. I feel like you're challenging me. She tilted her head to one side, studying him. I would definitely take that as a challenge if I were you. He chuckled. Brave and beautiful bride. Not sure what to think of that. Well, if you'd kiss me, we could both figure out what to think of the situation we're in. I need you to make my toes curl. Better take your shoes off and stick your feet out where I can see them then. I won't give up until they curl. Heidi shook her head. Trust me, Slade. You'll know if my toes curl. There will be no doubt in your mind. He put one hand on her cheek, tilting her head to the side, and he leaned down until his lips were less than an inch from hers. You sure you're ready for this? She nodded. I'm tough. I can take it. Slade lowered his lips to hers, slanting his mouth slightly. One hand stayed at her cheek, while the other went to her waist, pulling her closer. He kept his hand steady on her back as he let his lips do his talking for him. Heidi settled her hands at the back of his neck, giving him time to prove to her that he could make her toes curl. At the first touch of his lips, she felt a shock of passion rush through her. His kiss was practiced and sweet, not passionate, but it didn't seem to matter to her body. She curled into him, moving closer, her mouth opening under the onslaught of his. She wanted to climb into his lap and never stop touching him. Never in her life had she been kissed as Slade was kissing her. Finally, he lifted his head. How are those toes feeling? Curly as the lies of a politician. He chuckled at her words. Not a fan of politicians, I take it? She shook her head, still feeling the tingling his lips had caused. Not at all. In fact, the only profession I abhor more than politicians are doctors. He blinked a few times. You don't like doctors? At all? Doctors are all egotistical maniacs who think they should rule the world. I've never met one who was worth talking to or working for. In fact, I think all doctors should be thrown into a giant pit and buried alive. I prefer lawyers to doctors. He threw back his head and laughed, wondering what they were going to do now. Did you explain this deep antipathy toward doctors to Dr. Lachille? Or did you gloss over those points? She frowned. I should have, but I forgot. I thought about calling her after she left, but I figured there was little chance she'd match me with a doctor anyway. Why? You're not a doctor, are you? His eyes met hers as he slowly nodded. I am. Went to Baylor Medical School. What about you? What do you do? Chapter 3. Heidi sighed. I'm a nurse, which is why I'm so anti-doctors. She shook her head. I should have called her. Now what are we going to do? Slade grinned. We agreed to stay together for a year. I say we make the most of it. He understood her hatred of doctors and was aware most nurses felt the same way. He was sure he could make her change her mind, in time. But, I guess, we do need to at least live under the same roof for a year. He shook his head. Same bed. Your toes curled when I kissed you, remember? She matched us for a reason. You need to give me a chance. Heidi shook her head. You're a doctor, and I'm a nurse. I don't think there's any way it could work out between us. Sorry. Why did you agree to be matched up with a stranger? She shrugged. Because I didn't really have time to date, and I want children before I'm too old to enjoy them. He frowned at that. How old are you? 29, but all my friends have babies. You're fine for having kids. Stop worrying about your age. But, if you want kids soon, I'm happy to make them with you. You'd have a baby knowing our marriage can't last? Slade shook his head at her. I'd have a baby knowing our marriage can last. I saw you, and my heart skipped a beat. I know that sounds corny, but you're what I've been waiting for my whole life. Dr. LaShield gave me my dream woman, even if she didn't find you your dream man. He refused to give up. Before seeing her, he'd been sure hiring a crazy purple-haired woman was a mistake. Now he knew better. Heidi frowned at him. Don't say nice things. Doctors only bark orders. She refused to fall for this man. Let's make a deal. Let's forget we're doctor and nurse this weekend and just be man and woman, attracted to each other. Let's be newlyweds getting to know each other and spending a weekend together. She thought long and hard about his suggestion before she nodded. All right. I can do that for 2 days. Good. Now what's on the agenda for the evening? I have a photographer hired to take pictures of us in our wedding attire. I know it's a weird wedding, but pictures are important to me. He suggested going to a park in Dallas where we could see the skyline. We're supposed to meet him around 7. Slade nodded. Sounds good. Let me see if I can get us reservations for dinner at Reunion Tower afterward. So about 8:30 work? He looked at her dress. You'll have clothes to change into? Yeah, I brought another dress. Still really nice, but not quite so white. You look beautiful in white. He reached out and stroked her cheek. We should probably get out there. I want you to meet my twin brother, Seth, and his wife. They were matched by Dr. LaShield as well. Heidi smiled. My cousin and her husband were matched by them. She had a baby a couple of weeks ago. Another of the matrimony munchkins? He shook his head. Dr. LaShield is crazy. But just a bit, and I like her. He stood, holding his hand down for her. Let's go meet our loyal subjects. Oh, does that mean I'm queen for the day? He brought her hand to his lips after helping her to her feet. I have a feeling you'll always be my queen. She lost herself in his eyes for a moment. You're good at this. Good at what? He asked. Pretending to be just a man and not a doctor. He smiled. I am just a man this weekend. I even have another doctor handling all my deliveries. All your deliveries? Are you an OB? He nodded. I wasn't going to tell you that yet. Heidi laughed. I understand now why you needed to marry a woman sight unseen. No one could get past the fact that you look at vaginas all day. That's right. Sad, isn't it? As a woman who starts catheters and penises on a regular basis, I think we got this. She started for the door, but Slade stopped her. What? He gripped her waist and pulled her to him again, kissing her once more. You may only want to keep me for a year, but I want you forever, Heidi Henderson. You're pretty darn awesome. She smiled up at him. Come on. My parents are sure you're going to kill me in my sleep, and my brother has been laughing like a lunatic for 3 weeks. He thinks it's hilarious that I was so desperate I had to be matched at the altar. Is he married? Mark? No one would have him. He laughed. You never know. He may be calling Dr. Lachelle in a few weeks. That would be fitting revenge. Heidi had a gleam in her eye as they left the room. I can think of nothing that would make me happier. Against her wishes, Heidi had agreed to a wedding cake and punch in the church's fellowship hall, so she led him toward it. She could already hear the crowd and the noise they were making. This is the church I've gone to since we moved to Texas when I was 5. He looked around. Where did you move to Texas from? Wisconsin. I bet you love cheese. She made a face. How did I know you'd say that? Everyone says that. It's kind of what Wisconsin is known for. I know it for sledding down the hill next to my grandma's house and catching lightning bugs with my cousins, so we could keep them in jars and hide them in our sleeping bags while we were sleeping on her living room floor. Wisconsin is my aunt distracting my uncle so we could play in his treehouse that he didn't allow girls in. That's more what Wisconsin means to me. Family. We'll have to go together sometime. Heidi didn't respond. She didn't see their marriage lasting long enough for them to make a trip to Wisconsin. There were only about 30 people waiting for them, and Heidi was relieved. The ones she knew were family and very close friends. She led Slade directly to her parents. Mom and Dad, this is Dr. Slade Henderson. Her brother, who was flirting with one of the CNAs from work, started laughing again. A doctor? You hate doctors. Hush, Mark. Heidi made a face at her only sibling, wishing he could keep his opinions to himself, just this one time. Her father held out his hand with a smile. It's nice to meet you, Slade. Her mom smiled. Please tell me you're not a coroner. Slade shook his head. No, I'm an OB. He left off the GYN part of his title. He knew they'd all assume it. I help life begin, not end. Mark laughed even harder, and it was all Heidi could do not to hit him. Instead, she smiled at Slade. The idiot over there is my brother, Mark. Slade nodded. I'd guessed as much. Seth came over then, looking at Slade meaningfully, Michelle at his side. Heidi, this is my brother, Seth, and his wife, Michelle. They were matched by Dr. Lachelle. Heidi smiled at Seth, nodding. It's nice to meet you, Seth. Michelle. She looked back and forth between the two men. They were both handsome, but they weren't identical, and she was thankful for that. Michelle hugged Heidi. Welcome to the family. I just got married in May, so we're both pretty new. And do you like this family so far? Heidi asked with a grin. Slade slid his arm around her shoulders, anchoring her to his side. She wasn't sure if she liked the show of possession or felt uncomfortable with it. Either way, it was there, and she was going to have to put up with it. Michelle nodded emphatically. Our new mother-in-law, Judy, couldn't make it down from Boston for the wedding, because notice was too short. She's going to be in Louisiana to visit us soon, though. What part of Louisiana do you live in? Heidi asked. Shreveport was only a 3-hour drive from Dallas-Fort Worth. Oh, we're way down between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It's a 9-hour drive from here. Heidi wrinkled her nose. We will not be there next weekend. Slade laughed. It's only an hour into New Orleans by plane. We'll make it down to visit before long. I could do an hour on a plane. Michelle laughed. We drove, but we'd be happy to pick you up in New Orleans. Heidi liked that idea much better. Do you work? She asked. She really wanted Michelle to say she did, because she didn't want to be the only working wife in the family. I'm a high school principal. Oh, wonderful. I'm a nurse. I'm an assistant director of nursing in a nursing home in Northlake. Slade looked down at her. I didn't know you worked in a nursing home. I guess I just assumed you worked for a hospital. Heidi shook her head. I did when I first graduated from nursing school, but not anymore. She didn't add that the hospital is where she learned to hate doctors, because she was sure he'd already surmised as much. He had to know as well as she did how most doctors treated nurses. Interesting. Heidi shrugged at him, turning back to Michelle. When does school start back up for you? Last week. We have to head back today, and I hate that we have no time together. Of course, if we had time together the day you married, I'd probably have a problem with you. Heidi laughed, looking over at Slade. He was talking softly with his brother, and she couldn't help but wonder what the conversation was about. Is your school big? No, it's not. I know every single student in it. And they all know me. My students are pretty awesome, though. Seth smiled at Heidi. I'm really glad Slade took my advice and called Dr. Lachille. I have a feeling you two are going to be very happy together. Heidi smiled, unsure how else to respond. I sure hope so. Heidi's mom looked back and forth between Michelle and Seth. Are you two really happy? She asked. Michelle nodded. It started out kind of rocky, but you'd expect that. When two total strangers have agreed to spend their lives together, it makes sense for them to have a tough start, but now that we've been married a few months, we're both really happy. Heidi nodded. Did y'all take a honeymoon? We went to Disney World. It was amazing. Seth even wore the groom mouse ears all over the place. Is there a picture of said mouse ears? Heidi asked with a smile. She kind of wished she could put them on Slade for some of their wedding pictures. There are. Michelle fished her phone out of her Mickey Mouse purse. She quickly swiped through her pictures until she found what she was looking for. Heidi laughed softly as she looked at the picture of Michelle and Seth in front of Cinderella's castle. Oh, that's priceless. Michelle nodded. Those are memories I will treasure forever. Seth frowned at Michelle. Are you showing pictures of me in the mouse ears again? Michelle winked back. Do you really think I'd do that? Every chance you get. I have that one framed in an 8x10 behind my desk at school. Seth went to a game with me on Friday night and the kids all came to meet the Mickey Mouse Man. He wasn't as impressed with his new title as I was. Heidi grinned. I'm sure he wasn't. I should have done something like that with Slade, so I could send pics to the nurses he works with. I'm sure they'd love the blackmail opportunities. Are you not doing a honeymoon? Michelle asked. Heidi shook her head. I couldn't get off work for that long on such short notice. As it is, my boss is covering for me this weekend. I think Slade said his situation was similar. That's sad, but I'm sure you guys will work it out. We will. We're going to go get pictures taken in Dallas after this. I always wanted sunset pictures of the Dallas skyline for my wedding. That's a great idea. I bet they're gorgeous. Heidi's mom put her hand on her arm. You two need to go and cut the cake so you won't be late for those pictures. Heidi nodded. Slade, we need to go cut the cake. Slade looked at Seth. Duty calls. Heidi was impressed when Slade didn't smash the cake into her face, impressed and pleased. She fed cake to him with her fingers, making sure not to smear any. If he was good to her, she would be good right back. After they finished with the cake, they said their goodbyes. She walked past her car and cringed. There were condoms all over it. No, she was glad they were taking his car. He stopped at a relatively new Toyota. Do you have what you need? She nodded down at the bag she'd liberated from the bride's room. I'm ready when you are. He opened the door for her, helping to make sure her dress was tucked inside. Let's go to Dallas then. She gave him the exact address of the park, so he could punch it into his GPS, and they were on their way. After the photographer had finished their wedding pictures, they went to dinner, and Heidi was amazed at the scenery from the top of Reunion Tower. I assume you're moving in with me, he said. Heidi shrugged. My apartment probably isn't big enough for two. Where do you live? Southlake, he said, naming a high-dollar community north of Fort Worth. You? Roanoke. I wasn't sure what would happen, so I'll give notice to my landlords, and we can move me. She rubbed the back of her neck. She hadn't even started packing up, and the time that would take was not in her schedule. I'll hire movers to pack everything and move you. Really? She was shocked he'd even offer. Doctors usually expected nurses to not mind grunt work. As soon as the thought flitted through her mind, she forced it away. He was a man this weekend, and she was a woman. There was no doctor/nurse relationship. Really? I know how busy you are. I'm happy to do anything I can to help you. He carefully navigated the busy highway toward his house as they talked. Thank you. Heidi leaned her head back against the seat. The pretty pink dress she'd put on after the photos were taken was nice, but she was ready to be back in her jeans and t-shirt, or better yet, her scrubs. She would wear scrubs all the time if she thought she could get away with it. You're welcome. Slade carefully turned onto Highway 114 to drive toward home. Do you have everything you need for the weekend in your bag? Or should we stop by your house? I have everything I need. She thought about the sexy little nightie her coworkers had gotten her and blushed. Good. I'm ready to be home. Who's on call for you this weekend? I have a partner. We see each other's patients on occasion, but not terribly often. Heidi nodded. Good. So no chance of you getting called out of bed in the middle of the night? Not tonight or tomorrow night. After that, all bets are off. We try to go for our own patients when they're in labor, so there's really no time when I'm not on call. I understand. The Dawn and I share responsibilities. She takes one weekend and I take the next. During the week, we switch off as much as possible. She has a couple of kids still at home, though, so I tend to take the brunt of the overtime when I can. Sounds like we're going to be two ships passing in the night. Might make getting along easier, she said with a grin. Probably. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, or at least gives you less time to hate each other. Heidi laughed. Yeah. That's kind of what I was thinking. When they pulled up in front of his house, Heidi reached to the back for her bag and her dress. Slade put a hand on her arm. You get the dress, and I'll get the bag. All right. Heidi was pleased to see he was so considerate of her. It surprised her. He gave her a quick tour of the house, and she noted there were 3 bedrooms and a home office. If she ever got mad at him, she had somewhere to sleep. You can make any changes you want. I'm not super particular when it comes to decorating. Heidi nodded. All right. I'll change a few things, but probably not a ton. He took her to his bedroom last, waggling his eyebrows at her. And this is where we're going to make magic happen. At least I know you know your way around a woman's body, she said with a grin. Slade chuckled. Better than most men for certain. I'm going to take a nice, hot bubble bath before bed. I feel hot and sticky after the pictures. What was I thinking getting pictures like that taken in August in a park in Texas? I must have lost my mind. You did. I wasn't going to say anything, though. He nodded toward the bathroom. You use the master bath. Bathtub is best in there. I'll go shower in one of the spare bathrooms. While Heidi bathed, she couldn't help but think about the night she was about to have. Her wedding night, with a man who was almost a stranger, but who was very attractive. Too bad he was a doctor. She was going to make the most of it anyway. She knew it couldn't last, but she did want children. Why not get them while she could? She shaved her legs carefully and finally got out of the tub, brushing her hair down around her shoulders. She put on the flimsy little nightgown her friends had insisted on and went back into the bedroom to find Slade sitting with his back propped against the headboard, reading a book. It looked like a spy thriller type thing. Whatever. She wasn't all that worried about his reading habits at the moment. She slipped into bed beside him, feeling suddenly shy, something that was very rare for her. "Do you like to read?" she asked softly, trying to take her mind off what was about to happen. He finished his paragraph before putting a bookmark between the pages. "Yeah, I love to read. I just wish I had more time for it. When you're constantly exhausted from late-night deliveries, it's hard to care about what's happening in a book though." "That's sad," Heidi said, but she certainly understood. She was always tired from work as well, and seemed to read less and less every year. "I think so. Do you read?" "Yeah. I do. Not a ton, but I love to read. Like you, I don't have as much time as I would like for anything but work." She rubbed the back of her neck. Slade could tell she was nervous, so he didn't touch her yet, but instead turned to her on the bed. What else does Heidi wish she had more time for? Heidi thought about it for a minute. "I like a lot of things. I love to dance, but I never have time or a partner." He smiled at that. "You have a partner now." "I enjoy dancing a great deal." "Really?" He nodded. "I did a lot of country dancing when I was younger, and you should see me on a mechanical bull." Heidi laughed. "A mechanical bull? Really?" "Yup. On low speed, I can do all the standing stuff on the back of a mechanical bull. Honestly, it's how I worked my way through college." "How did you do that?" she asked, shocked at the very idea. Slade grinned. "Well, it started with my friend saying, 'I bet you can't stand on the back of that bull for one full rotation,' and they'd bet me $20 or whatever. I'd go to the bar during the day between classes and practice. Then when they came up with this outrageous stuff, I could do it. And then we started talking to strangers, and they'd put up money saying I couldn't do stuff. It was silly, but I made enough to eat that way. I've never heard of such a thing. Are you pulling my leg?" He shook his head. "No. I'll show you. Maybe we can try to do that next weekend. No promises, because I might get a call, but I'm always willing to at least try to do it. It honestly sounds like fun. Then we'll do it. As soon as we can." "Do it? Don't you have better words for the wedding night activities, Dr. Henderson?" He laughed. "Oh, I do. I can give you a whole list if you want." She laughed, moving toward him on the bed. "Maybe you should show me instead." Chapter 4. Slade grinned at Heidi. "Feeling bold?" She nodded. "I liked it when you kissed me, and if I'm going to forget your you-know-what, you'll have to kiss me more. Like, a lot more." He chuckled. "Thanks for trying to forget. Makes my life a bit easier." He stroked his hands up and down her arms. "You know you could always kiss me." "I could. I might later. Now, you have to kiss me. It's the natural order of things." "Why is that?" he asked. "No idea." He sighed, pulling her closer to him by her arms. "I'll do what you wish just this once. Don't get used to it." "Oh, I definitely know better than expecting a you-know-what doing what a nurse says to do." He leaned down and kissed her softly, more to get her to shut up than anything else. As she molded her body to his, he deepened the kiss. His hand stroked over her back, through the thin nightgown she wore. When she'd first stepped into the room wearing that thing, it had been all he could do to act casual and keep his eyes on his book. He was almost afraid to let her see what he felt for her though, with her feelings about doctors coming into the mix. Heidi sighed into his mouth, moving closer to him. She loved how his bare chest felt pressed against her breasts, and felt her nipples hardening into tiny points. Her hands roamed over his bare back and around to his shoulders and chest. His body was hard, and she was impressed. It had never occurred to her a doctor would be this fit. She'd noticed a home gym in one of the spare rooms, but had assumed he didn't use it. She now knew she was wrong. Slade's hand moved to the hem of her nightgown, moving up under it to her waist, and then up further to tease her nipple with his fingers. She let out a slight moan at the feel of his fingers. His lips left hers to kiss a trail down her neck and to her shoulder. "How would you feel about throwing this thing on the floor so I can feel all of you?" Heidi pulled away, lifting the nightgown over her head and tossing it away. "That make you happy?" His eyes were on her body. "Oh yeah. That makes me happy. Wow. It's like you've never seen a naked woman before." She winked at him playfully. He laughed, so pleased she could joke about his profession. "Oh, only once or twice." He pulled her onto his lap astride him, and she gasped as she came into contact with his bare skin. She didn't know why, but she'd assumed he was wearing something under the covers, but it was so obvious that he wasn't. He pulled her forward so her breasts were flattened against his chest and his hands went to her bottom, moving her over him. Heidi stared into his eyes as he slowly pressed into her. Her gasp of surprise caught him off guard. "Okay," he whispered. She nodded, closing her eyes and swallowing hard. "Feels good." Within moments, he was moving within her, his hands helping her to rise and fall over him. "Better than I dared hope," he agreed. When he felt her tighten around him, he was able to let himself go, and he gave a shout as he poured his seed into her. Never had he done that without a condom, and it felt so strange knowing he could make her pregnant. Knowing he wanted to make her pregnant. They curled together afterward, her back to his front, his hands stroking her body, his lips whispering words of praise against her ear. "We'll have to do this often," he finally said. She laughed. "From the sounds of our schedules, tomorrow night will be our last chance for several months." He grinned, biting her ear softly. "Oh, I think we can find the time and energy for this." She sighed contentedly, closing her eyes. It felt so good just to be held by him. It really was too bad he was a doctor and their marriage could never last. Asterisk. The next day was pure bliss in Heidi's mind. They did little except lounge around the house and swim in his backyard. Slade grilled out for lunch, and she promised she'd take her turn cooking at dinner time. There were only a couple of calls to interrupt, the first from her mother, while they were lounging by the pool. She sighed as she looked at the display. "It's my mom. I'm sure she needs me to reassure her you didn't kill me in my sleep." He grinned at her. "Tell her I'm really a vampire who transformed you, and now you glitter like the vampires in that stupid teeny bopper movie series." Heidi poked him as she answered. "Hey, Mom. Are you all right? I was hoping you'd call me this morning, and you didn't." "Mom, I have a 36-hour honeymoon. I'm not planning on spending a lot of time on the phone." "Well, you should take the time to reassure your mother. You married a total stranger yesterday." "He's not a total stranger anymore, Mom. I'm fine." "He's fine. No one has killed anyone else." Her mother sighed. "Heidi, I had a right to be worried about you. You did something very foolhardy." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry." Heidi rolled her eyes at Slade. "He's a good man, though." She almost told her mother their wedding night had been great, but she was sure her mom really didn't want to hear that, and she really didn't want to say it to her either. Pass the word around I'm still alive so no one else feels the need to call me, would you? Yes, I'll let everyone know. Bye, Mom. Love you. Heidi ended the call, looking at Slade. Thanks for not killing me on our wedding night. Why would I break my new toy? She laughed. I have no idea, but my mother was sure you would. Not me. I'm not nearly done playing with it. His phone rang 10 minutes later. Now it's my mom. Heidi laughed, shaking her head. How many well-meaning relatives could call them in an hour's time span? Hi, Mom. Yes, I'm still alive. She's not a serial killer. She's a nurse. Like you. He paused for a moment. Yeah, sure. Holding out the phone to Heidi, he said, she wants to meet you long distance. Heidi sat up straighter, though she wasn't certain why. Hello? A warm female voice came over the line. Hello, my daughter. Heidi grinned. I'm Heidi. You're a nurse too? I am. I work in a hospital. Oncology. You? I'm an ADON in a nursing home. Tough work. Slade did the smart thing and worked with New Life. He did. Heidi couldn't help but wonder what the woman wanted. I know you won't be able to visit right away like Seth and Michelle did, so I thought I'd let you know that I would appreciate some grandbabies sooner rather than later. Heidi laughed. I'll tell Slade he needs to work on that. Please do. I appreciate how reasonable you're being about this. Do you want children, Heidi? I do. That's why I went to see a matchmaker. I want them a great deal. Oh good. I'll let you go then. Drag my boy off to bed. Have a nice time. The phone went dead, and Heidi stared at it laughing. What did she say to you? Slade asked. She wanted to know if I wanted kids, so I told her I do. Then she said to drag you off to bed and have a nice time. Well? Well what? Heidi asked, her brows drawn together. She's your new mother-in-law. You'd better obey her. Heidi laughed, getting to her feet and walking toward the house. Where are you going? He asked, frowning. I thought I'd get out of this wet swimsuit and wait in bed for you, something about your mother being ready for grandbabies. Slade laughed, getting up and following her. I'll get out of mine too. Asterisk. Heidi groaned when the alarm went off the next morning. She hated mornings with the hate of 1,000 suns. On steroids. She rolled out of bed and stumbled into the kitchen, starting the coffee maker. While the coffee was brewing, she showered in an attempt to force herself to wake up. She was in her scrubs with her long hair pulled back in a ponytail when she walked back to the kitchen for her first cup of coffee. By the time Slade joined her in the kitchen fresh from his own shower, she'd had her second cup of coffee and felt mostly human. What time will you be home? He shrugged. If I have no emergencies or deliveries, I should make it by 6. With? Hopefully by this time tomorrow. She nodded. Sounds like me. I'll stop off at my apartment on the way to get more clothes to make it through the week. Catching her by the waist, he pulled her to him for a kiss. You look adorable in your pink scrubs. Thanks. Looking good for elderly blind people is the most important thing in life. Heidi spent quite a bit of the day on the floor, working with the patients. It was her favorite part of the job still, even though she had to spend a lot of time doing administrative tasks now that she was an ADON. She had a new nurse she was introducing to the patients shadowing her when she walked into Mrs. McPherson's room. Heidi loved Mrs. McPherson because she was always upbeat and singing. How are you this morning, Mrs. McPherson? Shush, came the response. My concert is about to start. Heidi smiled at Rhonda, her trainee, before turning back to Mrs. McPherson. Oh, I love it when you give concerts. Mrs. McPherson glared at Heidi and then began singing in a quiet, sweet voice. What a friend we have in. There was a long pause before she screamed, Jesus, at the top of her lungs. Heidi had been expecting it, so she just smiled, but poor Rhonda jumped at least a foot. After they'd left the room, Rhonda asked, why did she do that? She scared me. Heidi laughed. She knew she should have warned the new nurse, but sometimes you just had to experience people to believe them. Sorry, I probably should have warned you. That's how she always sings that song. And that's the only song she ever sings. Rhonda shook her head. I'm not sure I want to go in her room alone. Heidi found herself thinking about how fun it would be to share the story of Rhonda's introduction to Mrs. McPherson with Slade that evening, and she sighed. She needed to not start relying on him too much. He seemed sweet so far, but she was just waiting for his doctorliness to come out. She might have to strangle him with his own stethoscope when it happened. She was able to leave work on time, but as she left the building, she got a phone call. She looked at her phone and smiled when she saw it was Slade. Hello. Hi there. How's my favorite wife? I'd better be your only wife. She got behind the steering wheel and rolled the windows down for a moment to let the hot air out while she cranked up the AC as far as it would go. That's why you're my favorite. His voice grew serious. I've got an emergency C-section. I'm going to be home around 7 or 8 probably. Are you going to grab something to eat while you're out, or do you want me to save you dinner? She hadn't figured out what she was going to cook yet, so she didn't care either way. I'll grab something. Okay. See you then. Heidi decided to drive through Taco Bueno on her way to her apartment. It was easier than worrying about cooking for one person. She checked on the downstairs neighbor before going up. Miss Molly. How are you feeling? Heidi asked in a loud voice, hoping Miss Molly would be able to hear her. I'm fine. Don't shout. I have my hearing aids in. Heidi knew from experience the older woman would have them shut off in a minute or two. Do you need anything? I spilled orange juice this morning, and I'm having a devil of a time getting it cleaned up. Heidi smiled. I'll clean it up. You sit down and tell me about your shows. Miss Molly was a soap opera addict, and her favorite topic of conversation was the lives of the people in her shows. Heidi didn't mind listening while she helped the older woman. When she finished mopping, and Miss Molly finished telling her about her favorite couples, she asked, Is there anything else you need? I got married over the weekend, so I won't be living upstairs anymore, but you have my phone number, right? I can come over any evening you need me. Miss Molly frowned. You got married? Why didn't I get to meet your young man first? Heidi wasn't about to explain how the wedding had come about. It happened too fast. My parents didn't get to meet him till after the wedding either. Well, that's all right then. Heidi pulled Miss Molly's favorite Afghan off the back of the couch and draped it over her lap, knowing from experience she would decide she was freezing in 5 minutes. I'm going to be in my apartment for a few minutes getting some more clothes, so if you need me, let me know. I'm just going to be living up the road in Southlake, so you can call me. I will. My rotten kids wouldn't come if I called them. I need someone to look out for me now that I'm an old woman. You know I love you as much as I love my own grandmother. I'm here if you need me, Miss Molly. The older woman waved her away as she settled in to watch another of her favorite shows. Heidi hurried up the stairs, got enough clothes for the week and a few other things she thought she might want, and then packed it all into her car. She beat Slade home, but not by much. He found her in the closet in the master bedroom, hanging her scrubs beside his. He obviously wore green scrubs, but nurses at the nursing home wore pink scrubs. At least she'd be able to tell them apart. There's my wife. Heidi turned to him, lifting her face for his kiss. She was surprised by how easily she was settling into married life with this man, this doctor. You found me. He grinned. How was work today? She smiled as she related the story of Mrs. McPherson's introduction to Rhonda. He laughed, a grin lighting up his face. That's hilarious. How was your emergency C-section? Heidi asked. It was good. Mother and baby are fine. Father was still a little shaken up when I left the hospital, but that's to be expected. They always hate when we have to do a C-section. You ate? He nodded. I grabbed something in the hospital cafeteria. I was hungry. What did you have? Taco Bueno. Really? You seem more like a Wendy's salad type of girl. She laughed at that. Trust me. If I'm fast fooding, I'm doing Taco Bueno. It's my absolute favorite. I'll keep that in mind. And you? What's your fast food of choice? He shrugged. Not Taco Bueno. Probably Five Guys if I have to have fast food. I prefer to steer clear. But you'll eat hospital cafeteria food? Oh yeah. The cafeteria at the hospital where I do my deliveries is healthy, believe it or not. Really good food. I'll take your word for it. He laughed. You do that. Someday you'll have to come and see for yourself. I'm never going to willingly eat hospital cafeteria food. People don't do that. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, she remembered that her hairdresser had told her about her father taking her to a hospital cafeteria for lunch, because he loved the food so much. Okay, I know a few people do, but normal people don't. He laughed. I can agree with that. I promise I won't take you there on a date night. I really appreciate that. Where will you take me on a date night? She asked, walking out of the closet and shutting off the light. I was thinking this Friday we could go to a country bar I know where there's a mechanical bull, and they always have great bands. I want to show you how good I am on the bull, since you obviously don't believe me. Heidi rolled her eyes. Fine. You're great on a bull. I do love country dancing, though, so I'm more than willing to go. He grabbed her hand and pulled her against him. You will not believe how good I am until you see it. Trust me. She shook her head. Whatever. He leaned down and kissed her, his lips insistent on hers. I think it's been a really long day, and it's time for bed. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back. You know, sleep seems like just the thing. I'll go brush my teeth. He watched her walk away with a smile on his face. She may not like doctors much, but she wasn't letting it interfere with their relationship. He just hoped it would stay that way. He was getting undressed when his phone rang, and he groaned, knowing immediately who it was. It was time to make love to his wife and create a baby of his own, not run off and deliver someone else's. Hello? Dr. Henderson, one of your patients just came in. She's 6 months pregnant, and her blood pressure is 200/177. He sighed. I'm on my way. Most of the time he loved his job, but when it kept him from making love to his beautiful wife, he wasn't as pleased with it. Heidi came out of the bathroom wearing a slinky nightgown, similar to the one she'd worn on their wedding night. What's the look on your face about? She asked, obviously confused. He frowned. The look is grumpiness. I want to stay here and play newlywed games with you, but I just got called into the hospital. One of my patients is having blood pressure issues. She's not due for another 3 months, so I need to get in there. Heidi sighed. I'd say I'll wait up, but the truth is I won't. I'm tired. She walked to him and hugged him, kissing him quickly. Wake me up when you get home if it's not too terribly late. Slade shook his head. I'm not going to wake you. You sleep. We'll figure all this out as we go along. She nodded, hugging him one last time before he left. Be safe. I will. If I get too tired, I keep a couple sets of scrubs at the hospital and I can crash there if necessary. Hopefully I'll see you in the morning then. As Heidi watched him go, she rubbed the back of her neck. A doctor had to take care of his patients, which sometimes meant long hours. She couldn't get annoyed when he went off to do his job any more than she would put up with him being annoyed when she had to go in on her day off to cover for someone else. It was the way of the medical profession, and they could both hate it all they wanted, but it wasn't going to change. They would always be at the mercy of other people's medical emergencies. She grabbed her iPad and tucked herself into bed, tapping on Netflix to watch one of her favorite shows. She was too tired to read and needed something mindless to do to help her wind down and get ready for sleep. Making love with her husband was her first choice, but he was on his way to the hospital. She'd watch her show instead. When the opening music for Lazy Love came on, she sighed contentedly. A little bit of kissing between Joe and Dylan and her life would feel like it was back to where it should be. She'd just have to remember to pick a show where Dylan didn't have a medical emergency of his own. Chapter 5. It was almost midnight when Slade got back home and slid into bed beside Heidi. He wrapped his arm around her waist and snuggled close, closing his eyes immediately. It was nice to have someone to hold while he slept, even when they couldn't make love. Heidi rolled on her side facing him, moving closer in her sleep. He smiled and kissed her forehead. Being married was definitely wonderful. He just hoped she could get past her hatred for doctors. Asterisk. After lunch the next day, Heidi walked into her office, already tired. She was working extra hours so one of the other nurses would take her shift Friday. She had several things she needed to get done before she could get everything moved to the house she was sharing with Slade. Most were just phone calls, but she didn't want to waste her weekend with him making them. On her desk was the biggest bouquet of roses she'd ever seen. She leaned down and sniffed, the scent filling the nostrils. The card simply read, "Sorry to run out on you last night. Can't stop thinking of you. Slade." Heidi grinned, picking up the entire bouquet and setting it on a shelf where she could see it from her desk. Slade was shaping up to be a good husband. Who'd have thought a doctor had it in him? When it was time for her to have dinner, she was in her office doing some of the paperwork that never seemed to end. She rubbed her eyes, wishing she could just go home, but she needed to stay for at least another hour or two. She was hungry, though, and needed to eat something. She had forgotten to pack an extra lunch, and she wasn't about to venture into the cafeteria there. The food wasn't worth eating. She thought about ordering a pizza, making a face. It didn't really sound good, but that was the only place that would deliver, and she didn't want to have to leave to get anything. That would delay her even more. She looked up at a knock on the door, fully expecting it to be one of her nurses or CNAs with a question for her. Instead, her heart jumped into her throat as Slade stood in front of her, a Taco Bueno bag in his outstretched hand. "You are the most wonderful husband who has ever lived," she said, her eyes on the bag. He laughed. "Are you telling me that, or your tacos?" But gimme tacos. You really do love the things, don't you?" "They're my crack." Slade walked to her and handed her the bag, watching as she grabbed it, digging through for the tacos. He took the empty chair across from her, pulling out a Whataburger sack. She wrinkled her nose. "Whataburger? And you had the nerve to insult Taco Bueno?" "I like their burgers." "You would." She bit into the first taco and sighed happily. "You saved my life. I was just thinking about ordering a pizza, but I didn't want a pizza." "So I saved your life?" Heidi nodded. It was a noble gesture. She started to add that she'd be forever in his debt, but she didn't want him to get a big head. Obviously. He bit into his burger, wishing he'd thought to get drinks. "Is there a vending machine around here?" She nodded. "In the staff break room." "What do you want?" "I'll get a drink for each of us." She stood, digging change out of a little cup she kept quarters in. Coke is fine. Heidi nodded. I'll get it. Slade stood up. Let me walk with you. I'd like to see where you work. Just make sure you're nice to my nurses. I don't put up with any rude doctors in my facility. He casually draped his arm around her shoulder. Haven't I convinced you yet that I'm a nice doctor? She shrugged. Nope. I don't know that anyone can convince me of that. Heidi. The call came from one of CNA's. I need you. Heidi didn't ask any questions as she turned on her heel and jogged down the hall. She wasn't even aware that Slade was right behind her. What's wrong? Mr. Jones swallowed the lid of his water bottle again, and I think it's stuck in his windpipe. Heidi hurried around behind the man, whose face was turning blue. Did you try the Heimlich? She asked, carefully placing her hands in position to do so. Mr. Jones was always putting things he shouldn't into his mouth. He had advanced dementia, and they tried to keep things that were small out of his reach, but it didn't always work. She tried 2 compressions, but nothing happened. Mr. Jones. Slade jumped into action. Let me try. While I'm working on him, someone get me a straw and a scalpel. Heidi nodded to the CNA, who ran to do as ordered. She stood helplessly while Slade tried the same maneuver she'd just used. She hoped it wouldn't come to a tracheotomy. When he constricted the man the second time, the white lid popped out of his mouth and Mr. Jones gasped for air. Heidi stepped forward. Mr. Jones, you know you're not supposed to put things in your mouth. With Slade's help, she got him onto his bed, and she grabbed the stethoscope draped around her neck and listened to his chest. Her own heart was still racing from the scare. She removed the stethoscope and sat beside him on the edge of his bed. Are you all right, Mr. Jones? He nodded, coughing. I'm okay. Heidi was relieved, and her eyes met Slade's. She was thrilled he'd been there. Jenny, the CNA, hurried back into the room with a knife and a straw. I didn't know where to find a scalpel, so I just got a knife from the kitchen. Good thinking, Jenny. I'm happy to say we didn't need either one. Heidi nodded at Slade. That's my husband, Dr. Slade Henderson. It's nice to meet you, Dr. Henderson. Jenny looked back at Heidi. Of all the nurses in all the land, you're the one I would have called least likely to marry a doctor. Heidi shrugged. This one's kind of special. Jenny nodded. Seems like it. You go have fun with him while I see to Mr. Jones. No more water bottles, Mr. Jones. Heidi nodded. I want that noted on his chart. No more water bottles in his room at all. How did he get hold of one? His daughter came to visit, and she had one. She left it on the nightstand. You know how fast he is. I do know how fast he is. Heidi squatted in front of the man so she was looking him in the eye. No more swallowing things. Okay? Mr. Jones nodded. Okay. Heidi got back to her feet, patting Jenny's arm on her way out, taking the knife and the straw from her to return to the kitchen on her way. Mr. Jones would forget all about the conversation in a minute. I'll write up the incident report, all except the part one didn't see. You can fill that in when I'm done. I will. Heidi walked back into the hall, still a little frazzled. I'm glad you were here. Slade nodded. Me too. Can you enforce his visitors not drinking out of water bottles in his room? Heidi shrugged. I'm sure going to try. This isn't the first time that's happened. She sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. How's your patient from last night? He frowned. I'm keeping her in the hospital for a few days. She's over 40, and the pregnancy was an IVF pregnancy, so I'm not terribly surprised by the preeclampsia, but it doesn't make it any easier on her. We need to keep that baby cooking for as long as we can. Heidi shook her head. Is it her first? It is. They didn't start trying until she was 35, and then didn't bother seeking help until she was 38. Infertility takes a long time to diagnose and treat properly. I wish she'd have tried sooner. She understood completely. Like when she was 30 and newly married to a hot doctor. Well, her husband's not a doctor, but if you're referring to me, definitely. He winked at her. Wait here. I'm going to put this in the kitchen, and then we'll go to the break room. She hurried in and left the knife and straw, which was still wrapped, before going back to join him. Now we can go get our drinks. When they got back into her office, the first thing she noticed was the bouquet of flowers sitting on the shelf. Thank you for the flowers. They made my day. He grinned. You like them? Of course, I do. And you never have to apologize about going to see a patient. Of all the things I understand, that's at the top of the list. We're both professionals, and work comes first. He sat down and took another bite of his burger. It's not hot. Heidi laughed. When was the last time you ate a hot meal? Oh, I eat them hot a lot, he told her. I eat them so fast they don't have time to get cold. She sighed. Sounds like a medical professional to me. She pushed her paperwork to the center of her desk as she unwrapped her second taco. What made you decide to surprise me with tacos? Not that I'm complaining. He grinned. Oh, I know you're not. You were too happy to see those tacos to complain. Why, it could make a man feel neglected. He surprised his new wife with tacos, and she ignores him for food. She blew him a kiss as she took another bite. I decided to surprise you because I missed you, he answered simply, wondering if she'd believe him. She smiled, her face softening. You sure do know all the right things to say to catch my attention, she said with a grin. She reached over and stole one of his fries. Thanks. He shook his head. Does being married mean I never get to eat all my own fries again? Heidi thought about it for a moment before nodding. It probably does. What was I thinking? She shrugged. I'm not complaining. And she realized she wasn't. She didn't know why it felt like he was so different from other doctors, but it did. She needed to remember who he was, and not let herself fall in love with him. When a tiny voice whispered that it was too late, she chose to ignore it. Why would she listen to it when it was saying something she really didn't want to hear? As soon as they were both finished eating, he got up to go. I'll see you in a couple of hours. She nodded. I should be home by 9. Walking around her desk, he kissed her softly. I'll be waiting. Hey, Dr. Henderson? He looked at her with one eyebrow raised. You're something else. He grinned, walking out the door. He hoped he'd scored a few points with the flowers and the tacos. Not with Mr. Jones, though. He was just doing his job with Mr. Jones. Heidi watched him go, sighing contentedly. She really could get used to having that man around. She pulled her paperwork to her. She had a pile to get through that night if she wanted to take all of Friday off to deal with moving. Vicky was a great boss, but Heidi needed to be a great employee to deserve her benevolence. And she would be. Asterisk. It was 9:15 when Heidi walked in the front door. She called Slade's name but didn't see him anywhere. She wandered around until she found him in bed, obviously exhausted. It was going to be a long week. She showered and then climbed into bed, snuggling close to him. He pulled her even closer. You made it home. I did. Everyone was alive and accounted for when I left. Glad to hear it. His hand stroked her back. Now we have to celebrate. Celebrate what? She asked. Tuesday. We have to celebrate Tuesday. His mouth came down on hers and he kissed her softly. "Want to celebrate with me?" She laughed. "Sure. Tuesdays are pretty special. We only get 52 per year." "That's right." Asterisk. By the time Friday morning rolled around, Heidi was ready for her day off. She stayed in bed to sleep in a bit as Slade got ready for work. He dropped a kiss on her lips before leaving. "Get lots done today." She nodded, trying to keep her eyes open. "Have a good day." An hour later, she was up and showered, gulping down the coffee he'd made. "A man who leaves his wife coffee is special," she muttered to herself as she took another swig. She made some phone calls to get the ball rolling and thought about surprising Slade at his office. Seeing how he worked with his staff was very important to her. She finished up everything she had to do for the morning, and she drove to Fort Worth to his office, stopping to get lunch on the way. When she arrived, she went to the window, knowing she'd gotten in just before they'd close for lunch. "I'd like to see Dr. Henderson." "Do you have an appointment?" Heidi shook her head. "I have a wedding ring." "That trumps an appointment, right?" The receptionist smiled. "You must be Heidi. Would you mind having a seat? He's finishing up with a couple of patients." Heidi nodded, taking one of the chairs there. She took out her phone and checked her emails, making sure there were no emergencies at work. The woman beside her, obviously in her last trimester, smiled at her. "I thought Dr. Henderson was single." Heidi smiled. "Not since Saturday." She held up her hand with the wedding ring on it. "This is my third baby he'll deliver. He's wonderful. I couldn't ask for a better doctor. He's a pretty great husband, too." Heidi loved to hear good things about him. Maybe he really was the exception to her rule that all doctors were egotistical maniacs. "Do you want children?" the woman asked. Heidi nodded. "I really do." "Will Dr. Henderson deliver them?" Heidi wrinkled her nose and shook her head. "We're going to be practicing separation of church and state. I won't even see his partner." The woman laughed. "I can understand that. My husband is a lawyer, and I wouldn't let him represent me in a divorce." She winked at Heidi. The door opened and a nurse called out, "Mrs. Wright?" The woman beside her got up. "It was nice talking to you, Mrs. Henderson." "You too," Heidi said with a smile, thinking about how strange the name sounded when applied to her. The receptionist stood up then. "Come with me. I'm going to put you in his office." She led Heidi into a small office and had her sit in a chair across from the desk. "I'm going to leave the door cracked and let him know you're here." Heidi nodded, going back to her phone. She could hear Slade's voice and listened with a smile on her face until she realized what he was saying. "I don't ever want you speaking like that to a patient again. If you worry something is wrong, you come to me, and I will deal with it." Heidi heard some mumbling in response. Slade's voice had been harsh, very harsh. He said something else that she couldn't quite make out, and then she saw the door open and a nurse came into the room crying. "Oh. Can I help you?" she asked, swiping a tear away. "I'm here to see Dr. Henderson." "Does he know you're waiting?" Heidi shrugged. "I believe so. I'm not an emergency. Just his wife." She knew she shouldn't get involved. "Are you all right?" The woman nodded. "I'm fine." She left the room then, and Heidi felt badly, because she'd obviously just needed a place to calm down a little. She had no idea what had happened, but her first thought was that Slade must have overreacted. Doctors were always yelling at nurses for no particular reason, and it made her mad. When Slade came into his office 20 minutes later, he was rubbing the back of his neck, obviously tired. "I brought lunch," Heidi told him, holding up the takeout bag from a small Chinese restaurant down the street. "Oh, good. I usually send my staff out for something, and we eat together, but I'm more than a little frustrated today." I don't think I could eat with them. Heidi frowned. What happened? She didn't mention she'd heard him getting on to someone, and she definitely didn't mention that she'd assumed the worst of him. He sighed. We hired a new nurse who just started on Monday. She was using the Doppler with a very newly pregnant woman and couldn't find the heartbeat. She told her that miscarriages happen early all the time, and she'll get pregnant again. He shook his head. When I got into the room 5 minutes later, the poor woman was hysterical. I tried the Doppler and found the baby's heartbeat. She was still upset, so I did a sonogram and showed her the baby. She wasn't convinced until she saw it moving around. Heidi's eyes widened, and she was immediately ashamed of what she'd thought of him. That's awful. She can't be talking to patients that way. What if she had lost the baby? That's not the way to find out. No, it's not. The worst part is it's the patient's third pregnancy, and both of the others ended with first trimester miscarriages. He took the food she offered him. I wanted to slap that nurse. I don't blame you one little bit. What she'd heard wasn't nearly harsh enough for what she thought the nurse deserved. What was she thinking? I'm sorry to intrude on a tough day. You're not intruding. I'm thrilled you're here. Chinese and a beautiful woman to look at are just what the doctor ordered. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. Know how I know? Heidi grinned, shaking her head. How? Because I'm the doctor. She laughed. You're silly. Probably. He ate a forkful of orange chicken. I love this place. Did you get fortune cookies? Of course. What's Chinese food without fortune cookies? She grabbed them both from the bag and threw him one. You have to wait till we're done to eat yours, though. Why? She shrugged. Rules are rules. That's not a rule. Sure it is. I just made it. And it has to be obeyed. You know how I know? He shook his head, eyeing his fortune cookie, and thinking about unwrapping it despite her rule. Because I'm the nurse. He grinned at her. Did you get everything done this morning? She nodded. Lights are set to be shut off. Movers will be there first thing tomorrow to get everything packed up and moved to your house. I've also rented a storage unit for some of my stuff that's not going to fit in your house. You don't need to keep it. I have enough furniture. She shrugged. I'm keeping it. Someone will need it. Just so you're not planning to leave me as soon as our year is up, because I've decided to keep you, no matter what the contract says. Heidi frowned at him. And what happens if I refuse to be kept? I have duct tape. She couldn't help but laugh. Duct tape, huh? Slade nodded. Did you know it's possible to tape a grown man to a wall with duct tape? Imagine what I could do with a small nurse. You, Dr. Henderson, have lost your mind. He sighed. I know. Isn't it great? When they finished eating, she walked around his desk to kiss him. I'll see you in a few hours, I hope. He grabbed her, pulling her down onto his lap. No babies have ever been made in this office, but a few have been delivered here. We could make the first. She shook her head. Not so appealing. You look at other women here, not me. Separation of church and state. He laughed. My patient you met in the waiting room told me you said that to her. I approve wholeheartedly. I don't even want to see a doctor you know. It would be too squicky. Well, we don't want anything squicky. Be ready to go out tonight when I get home. I think we can make it without being called. Heidi smiled. Country dancing? He nodded. I'm going to prove to you that I'm an expert on a mechanical bull. She kissed him one last time. You'd better be. It's the only reason I married you. She headed for the door. Heidi. She turned to look at him. What? Thanks for lunch. Anytime. She had a smile on her face as she left. She didn't know what the future would bring, or what she would find out about him later, but right now, she thought her husband was pretty darn awesome.